And in the House of Representatives, the number 2 finisher, John Quincy Adams, joined forces with the number 4 finisher, Henry Clay of Kentucky, who was one of Jackson's bitter enemies, and who was also the Speaker of the House, and who could swing the vote the way he wanted. And the vote wound up making John Quincy Adams president. And Andrew Jackson's supporters contended that this was the result of what they widely called a corrupt bargain. And the corruption came about when, shortly after Quincy Adams won the vote in the House of Representatives, he turned around and appointed Henry Clay to be Secretary of State. Now you might think, well, big deal, Secretary of State. In those days, the Secretary of State was the heir apparent to the presidency. Vice presidents had no future in those days. The Secretaries of State became the next president. This had been the practice from Thomas Jefferson on through John Quincy Adams, who had recently been Secretary of State. And so Henry Clay had every reason to believe, and people in the United States had every reason to believe, that Henry Clay was the next president of the United States. Now this is important not simply for the frustrated ambitions of Andrew Jackson, but because it seemed to reject the idea of democracy, that people could choose their president. This was the first election in which a majority of the electors were chosen by ordinary people. Until then, the electors had been chosen mostly by state legislatures. And they could be today still. Nothing in the Constitution says you get to vote for president. You don't even get to vote for electors. The states shall choose the electors. That's what the Constitution says. And if the states choose to do it by legislative fiat, they can. Anyway, the fact that John Quincy Adams became president by a result of this bargain with Henry Clay seemed to the Jacksonians, who were going to be called the Democrats very shortly, it seemed to be a denial of the basic principle of democracy, because the Jacksonians knew that Quincy Adams and a lot of people of Adams' persuasion in politics did reject the idea of democracy. You will remember from your study of history that democracy wasn't something that the Founding Fathers thought was a good thing. They thought it was a bad thing. They wrote this Constitution to ensure the prevention of democracy. Now things evolved so that by the 1820s, democracy came to be the way most people thought the country ought to be governed, but not John Quincy Adams, not his supporters. And so Jackson thought, and his supporters thought, that the fact that he had lost, particularly by the way he had lost, meant that democracy was really at stake here. So Jackson ran again in 1828, and this time he won. And one of his loyal supporters was John Eaton. And so Andrew Jackson was a person who never forgot his friends, couldn't do too much to further the careers, to further the personal interests of his friends. And Andrew Jackson thought that John Eaton had been a good staff soldier and a good leader of men, and so he decided that he would name John Eaton Secretary of War. It was a good job for Eaton, and it was a good thing for Andrew Jackson, because he had somebody who was loyal to him and somebody who was reasonably knowledgeable about the art and practice of war. And that was going to be great. But a problem arose when John Eaton explained that he had fallen in love. Well, that's fine, said Andrew Jackson. Is she a good woman? Now this is where Andrew Jackson's perceptions of women has to be explained. Andrew Jackson could never bring himself to believe anything evil about any woman. Andrew Jackson had, I hope no one will take offense if I should say, he had an exaggerated notion of female virtue. He had a mother who died. His father died before he was born. He never knew his father, also called Andrew Jackson. He had known his mother, but his mother died when he was 14 years old. As a result of her successful attempt to spring Andrew Jackson from a British prisoner of war camp during the American Revolution, she trekked scores of miles across the wilderness to talk the British commander of this prisoner of war camp into releasing her son. Andrew Jackson was one of the youngest soldiers, well, I wasn't formally a soldier, one of the youngest combatants in the American Revolution. He joined the American Revolution at the age of 13. He was taken prisoner at the age of 14. His mother wanted to get him out of a prisoner of war camp because prisoner of war camps in those days, as for many years, were notorious breeders of infectious disease. And cholera was running through the camp, and smallpox as well. And Jackson, in fact, caught smallpox, as did his brother, who was taken prisoner at the same time. And his mother came and rescued the boys from the prisoner of war camp. And she brought them home. On the way home, Jackson's brother died of the disease he contracted. His mother died shortly. Andrew Jackson was left alone in the world. His other brother had died as well in the war, and so he was left alone. But he had this memory of the heroic actions of his mother, a mother who would stop at nothing to save and protect her children, including Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson developed these ideas, these memories of his mother that he revered and he followed for the rest of his life. One of the things his mother said was that if he were injured by any man, suffered a physical or other kind of injury, he should never sue that person at court. No, he should take it upon himself to demand redress. And she told him this when he was a young man, and what she said is, okay, if the person who beat you up or otherwise wronged you is too big for you to handle right now, well, wait a few years till you get bigger, and then go after him. And so Jackson had this notion of women as existing in the realm of saints. His wife Rachel, he put in the same category. Now, with Rachel, it was a little bit more of a problem in that Jackson, here's where the personal and the political really intersect. And Jackson fell in love with Rachel when she was married to another man. Now, her husband had abandoned her. His husband had physically abused her and then abandoned her. He was nowhere around. In those days, though, it was nearly impossible to get a divorce. The only way you could, there were no general divorce laws. To get a divorce, you had to apply to the state legislature and get them to pass a bill saying that, okay, you can divorce this person. So John Roberts can divorce Rachel Roberts. And they learned, or at least they said they learned later, that the first husband, Roberts, had applied for a divorce bill with the Virginia legislature because they had been married in Kentucky, which at that time was the western counties of Virginia. So they heard the divorce was going through. This is the story that they later told. There's reason to doubt its veracity. But anyway, they heard, or they said they heard, that the divorce was going through, so they assumed that they gave enough time for the divorce to be final, and then they became married. Except they never heard officially that the divorce had been declared final, but the Virginia legislature was meeting hundreds of miles away across the mountain, so the news took time, and anyway, it might have got lost on the way. The fact of the matter is that they fell madly in love and they got married. And this was not scandalous at the time, not in Western Tennessee. Notions regarding marriage were rather different than they are today because people disappeared and they didn't come back. They abandoned their wives, they abandoned their husbands, and what people typically did in such circumstances was take up as common law husband and wife. And that way, if the missing spouse eventually reappeared, then there was nothing formal and you could deal with it at that point. And it didn't become an issue. It wasn't an issue for a while until Jackson went into politics. And then his political enemies began saying that he had stolen another man's wife. Well, Jackson didn't take lightly to this sort of criticism, to these aspersions on his own character. But he especially didn't take lightly or warmly to the obvious implication that Rachel was an adulterer, or maybe even a bigamist. And so Jackson might have called out someone on a matter of honor for the insult against himself, but when Rachel's name was brought into it, then it really got him. That's what led to Charles Dickinson's death.